Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the fourth lecture of the lecture series on architectural styles of India. Today's talk is titled The Community, the Settlement, and the Shelter, the Vernacular Architecture of Nagaland by Ms. Ritu Varuni. Ritu Varuni trained as an architect and has been associated with craft design and traditional craft skills since 1994. Her design studio, Ethan, based in Himachal Pradesh, specializes in wood and bamboo-based design and hand skills, wherein her unconventional composite architectural design palette can be seen. The use, research, and development of bamboo as a material for craft and architecture has been the focus of her work in Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh since 1991, the latter being her home for 6 years. Ritu has done various design development and craft-based livelihood projects as an empaneled designer with DC Handicrafts, Ministry of Textiles, and various other organizations. Ritu's design work has been regularly exhibited at the India Habitat Center, New Delhi, and recently presented at the India International Center, New Delhi. She has represented India at international conferences, workshops, and exhibitions, including the recent ongoing Venice Design 2019. She has published many articles over the years. Her book on Konyak and Sumi, Vernacular Naga Architecture, which was facilitated by an INTAC scholarship grant in 1991, is currently under publication. Before we begin, I would like to call upon Professor Rajat Ray to briefly speak about the research on architectural styles of India. Professor Ray, thank you.
This is a necessary evil. Before every lecture like that we have been having, this one is like a commercial before the YouTube video. This is a little more organized now, and this is going to be more concretized in very soon. So this lecture series, of which we have already had 3, Benny Kuriakose, K.T. Ravindran, and Hemant Sanghvi, and today we have the 4th lecture. This series actually is different from the INTAC's regular lecture series. This is part of actually another larger project. That project is aimed to become a repository of our knowledge base regarding vernacular and architecture and heritage buildings of the country. And these are sourced from various sources, from institutions which have been working on these areas, from individuals who have been working on some of these specific areas individually in different ways. And we are putting the data together. The project has these 2 dimensions. Of one is the collection of this data and putting it into a web accessible repository system where it should be accessible to, as we say, at one level, lay people primarily, and then maybe even school children, then architects, and then who are doing higher level research. I dare say that this is something like a bottom-up approach to heritage. As you can notice that heritage has so far been even looking at the best and the unique, outstanding universal value. That is one direction that has to be there. So it seems to be coming downwards, and people are in search of heritage from top. At the same time, there are a lot of things in the country which are not really known by people as much as in terms of architecture, as much as, for example, even music. A lot of people know a lot about music, a lot about even textile nowadays, but architecture people don't know. So that's the idea. And this thing also, I must mention that INTAC, over so many years of INTAC's involvement and experience as an awareness generating agency, has looked at 3 things. One is in terms of built heritage, apart from heritage zones or larger areas. In terms of built heritage, vernacular architecture is one area. And then heritage buildings is another area. And monuments is another area which ASI has been looking at. So INTAC actually started looking at the non-ASI buildings. So monuments one category, but still many monuments of that kind which are not really well known by people. Then INTAC comes to look at heritage buildings, which are more urban and which are qualified, people know now, quality of architectural quality and various cultural associations are not really known by people in that sense as much as it could possibly be. And the third is vernacular architecture, which is more rustic and rural. So these three things exist within tech. So we collect this data, connect with the people and institutions who are doing research on these areas. Architectural institutions have their own agenda in different ways. They may or may not discuss such things. So those could be other locales which could do such a research, but Intech becomes a unique organization who can do it objectively. Recently also there is a theoretical dimension to it, regarding which there can be many objections and many criticisms and discussions, which are also welcome, because we hope to address this idea of style, which is understood by many people as a colonial imposition, which is true to a certain extent, because there is Hindu architecture, Islamic architecture, then there has been Indo-Saracenic architecture. Such sort of nomenclature or such Christianism are not necessarily are free from various value systems. So we hope to, when you collect this data, organize this in a very simple, basic framework where the question of theory comes, but it's not very difficult eventually, so that such ideas can also be rediscussed and one can look at them in a contemporary perspective. So I'm sorry I've taken a lot of time. I welcome Ritu to start.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about the architecture of Nagaland, vernacular architecture of Nagaland. I wanted to actually begin with a small story that was told to me when I was a student. And as a student, I was very lucky to be able to document and research vernacular architecture in Nagaland, which no longer exists today in the same form. There's been a lot of drastic change since 1940 in Nagaland, and a lot of what I saw then, there's no evidence of now. So in that sense, I feel very lucky to have witnessed things, even including construction of big buildings like the chief houses, which no longer happen anymore. So I'd like to begin this with a little story that was told to me in the village in 1991. This is the Konyak legend. Konyak is one of the 17 major tribes of Nagaland, and one of which I researched for my thesis. There was Zongma. Zongma was the spirit, the creator. Nothing was greater than Zongma. And he had two sons, Nipu and Nili. This was a long time ago, many ages ago. And the two sons had no form. They had no human form. They had no animal form. They did not look like the rocks. Many ages passed, and one day Nipu decided to build the earth. And Nili decided to build the sky as a lid to cover the earth. And when Nipu finished with the earth, Nili said that the earth was way too big and his sky was too small and would not fit on top. So he urged Nipu to adjust the earth somehow so that the sky could fit on the earth. And so Nipu pulled and pushed the land, and that's how some of this earth stood up as mountains. So this is the story of how the mountains came about. This is one of the Naga legends, and I thought it was very sweet and would be a nice way to begin this talk, though it's nothing to do, I suppose, directly with architecture, but still. I think everything has a background, and it's very important to see the background for vernacular architecture. In that sense, the connect between the community, the settlement, and the shelter, these three are inextricably linked. And the built environment is a direct product of the natural environment in which it stands, and especially in the vernacular. And the vernacular construct is made up of these three: the community, the settlement, and the shelter. So in that sense, I feel like a flavor of the place is very important as a starting point to understand where we're coming, where the built environment comes from, and how it really evolved. I think first slide. The 16,500 square kilometers area that is Nagaland or encompasses the state of Nagaland is basically a hilly terrain with low hills that between 600 and 2,000 meters, the highest being a little over 2,000, which is Mount Saramati. It has a temperate climate, which goes from subtropical and alpine and sub-Himalayan sort of vegetation. It's an area of very high rainfall and thick rainforests, which once had an abundance of wildlife, both of which are considerably diminished now. So this is the backdrop that provides, this is the forest, this is where the building materials came from. So naturally we have an abundance of building materials, especially timber and bamboo and thatch, which are the primary building materials that this kind of terrain provided. The now 11 districts, when I was actually researching, there were 7. These political boundaries tend to keep changing and confusing us, but at least 2 days ago, there were 11 districts. I don't know, I hope nothing's changed since, because facts can be changed quite easily these days. So we have these 11 districts and we have 17 major tribes that make up the state of Nagaland. Very few people actually know that the word Naga doesn't actually mean anything. It's just a loose term that connects 17 major tribes which are quite distinct from one another. Though they have a certain general similarities do exist, but the word Naga actually is said to there are many theories about where it originated from, but possibly the one that says that the word Naka, which is K instead of G, which is often interchangeable, came from Burma, Myanmar now, and refer to men with pierced earlobes. So that's possibly one of the possible origins of the word. Anyway, this is used to describe these 17 major tribes with distinct differences in dress, custom, tradition, of course, architectural styles. And it's possible to broadly classify this into the Western and Eastern Nagas, this broad two categories, which I've kind of listed here, whether Angami, Ao, Chaksang, Kachar, Kuki, Lotha, Rengma, Simi, and Ziliang from the Western Nagas, and the Chang, Konyak, Hom, Pochuri, Khimgan, Sangtam, Tikhir, and Yimchungar form the Eastern Nagas. So this is based on geography and on tradition to some extent, because the Western Nagas are more closely linked to one another, and Eastern are also closely linked to one another. Even in terms of architectural styles, you find that this distinction can work. Though each and every tribe has its own distinct style of architecture with varying design and form. As I said, we begin with the community. I just want to introduce a little bit about the community and its distinctions. There are absolutely different governance systems too between the tribes. So the built environment is often a mirror of the social structures existing in a particular place. And in Nagaland, the Nagaland dwelling, or at least in the vernacular, in the ancient times when Nagaland was an animist, Naga tribes were basically animist. Now, of course, there's a change to Christianity, but out here, when we talk about vernacular architecture, we talk about the animistic time when the social systems were basically based on animistic belief. And the 17 major tribes with distinct languages, traditions, and socio-political structures would form the base of the Naga community. In earlier times, they were autonomous, very self-sufficient communities, and they had very little contact with one another or the rest of the countries. they were in a state of perpetual warfare with each other. So neighboring tribes often were at war, and so defense, etc., was a paramount sort of concern for the tribes at the time. These things have, of course, changed drastically now. They had distinct governance systems which varied from democratic councils to the king-like status of the Konyak Angs or chieftains, who were thought to have divine status, and to other chiefs of the who were hereditary, like the Sema and the Angami chiefs. So there was a wide variety in the whole socio-political systems of all the tribes. And this translates into their built environment too. This is what I'm trying to come to. Most Naga settlements, ancient settlements, were built on ridges and spurs for strategic reasons, and because there was an overpowering sort of priority given to defense in the past because of this, like I said, the constant warfare between the neighboring tribes. There's a common tendency for all the tribes to build either along the ridge or into the hill. And as you can see over there, the village in the corner, left-hand corner, this one. This is Longwa village on the Myanmar border. It's India's, so to speak, last village. It's a very interesting village actually, because when you stand in the Ang's house, as you enter, one foot is in Burma and the other technically in India. His kitchen is in Burma and his bedroom is in India. So that's how the line was drawn and the boundary demarcated. So it's now a major tourist attraction because everybody wants to straddle two countries at the same time. This is a view of the terrace fields of Konoma, which is an Angami village. Very famous again because of Fizo, one of the Naga leaders, separatist leaders who belong to this village. It's a beautiful village and very famous for its stonework actually. There's not a lot of stonework in Nagaland, so it's one of the few places where stone masonry is visible. And it's beautiful actually. This village here is Shangnu village in Mon district. It's a Konyak village in the northernmost district of Nagaland. As you can see, all the villages are laid out on towards the top of the hill. This is a very old picture, as you can see, but it's a Sema village. Semas always preferred the highest possible point for their villages, again for the same defense or strategic reason. The settlement was usually laid out in kind of like a concentric circles in a sense. The topmost part would form the main body of the settlement. The spatial organization of the settlement also showed the hierarchy in the social systems, wherein the chief's house was always at the highest point of the settlement. Around the main body of the settlement, the next level was basically the granaries, which were at the fringes to protect them from a possible fire hazard. So because that was food, and food was everything. So this was a common feature amongst all the tribes, that the granaries would be at the fringes. And all settlements had a kind of defense fortification around them. The Angamis had huge gates, in fact. Others used kind of panjit bamboo fencing, which was like these sharp-edged fencing and ditches. So within these natural kind of boundaries, each tribe practiced hunting, farming, and fishing. So natural boundaries for most Naga settlements were like rivers, hills, and other natural features like rocks and things in some cases as well. The naming of settlements was also based on natural features or legends. For example, Longching village in Mon district is a derivative of two words Long and Ching. Long meaning stone and Ching meaning village. So village of stones, which defined its very naturally rocky terrain that it had. So like I said, that most tribes occupied specific areas with the defined natural boundaries and practiced within that. The last of the like beyond the granaries came the fields, the cultivable fields, and these were community owned and usually designated by the chiefs of the village to different families. The practice of farming was jhuming, which is actually a kind of shifting cultivation wherein a certain patch of land or forest was burnt, and there was a cycle. So you would cultivate for a few years and then shift to another, while that one recovered from the burning. And this pattern of farming was called jhuming, and actually the jhum cycle used to be up to 20 to 25 years. So it was left fallow for 20 to 25 years and then one would return to it. But with pressures on land, etc., and population, in later years, the jhuming cycle reduced and caused a lot of deforestation in the more recent times. So there is a shift towards terrace cultivation now. I just want to point out that about the clustering system in most of the villages. In most settlements, the clusters were linear, arranged around a arterial pathway which connected all the houses. The houses were always sort of clustered in a kind of like very closely packed clusters. In certain tribes, sorry. In certain tribes, this, for example, is a Konyak village, Longching village. The houses were so close that the eaves of each one touched the other, and this was primarily for not an accident. It was deliberately done so that so that the sort of the wind pressures etc. on the top of the mountain, there was tremendous wind pressure, so they were counteracted or balanced by this close kind of clustering of houses. This is a cluster of Konoma village. The Angamis had these kind of circular seating areas at various parts in the settlement where there were gatherings used to be held of the elders. This is a Lazimi village, is a Sema village in Zinebota district. This shows you the cluster of granaries towards the lower bit of the settlement. There were many ceremonial rituals as well while siting settlements in earlier times. These are, of course, since most of the settlements are really old and they can't really be dated, there's not a lot of information on how the siting used to take place. Most of the villagers said that the settlements were sited by the chiefs. And amongst the Konyaks, the Angs had full control over how to site a particular settlement, and it was totally on their whims. So if an Ang didn't like a particular site, then it was completely discarded, and no reasons asked. Basic shelter types that made up or designed the settlement were the house. In the house, there were basically two types of houses, broadly speaking. One was that of the commoner and the other that of the chief. Then there was the morung or the dormitory, which formed the heart of the settlement because these were institutions that actually controlled the entire administration of the settlement. Then the granary and the field hut. So these were the kind of shelter types that actually made up the entire settlement. All shelters, all of these shelters were built by the community as a whole. This was also across a common practice across the tribes. All male members usually did the construction, and the collection of material was done by both the sexes, but the actual construction work was done by the men. In the case of the chief's house and the morungs, the community as a whole, the entire village, one person or two persons from every household would come and voluntarily give their labor towards building these. Whereas individual houses were built by the colony, because the settlement was always divided into colonies, which was sort of based on clan groupings in most cases. The women always prepared the meals and refreshment for all the workers. There used to be a lot of community eating as well. So it normally took about 2 or 3 days to build a house, and at the end of the third day there would be a big feast, and this was prepared by the women, and everybody would partake. This was looked after by the owner. No kind of other remuneration was ever expected. But there was a fine of a pig, or in very drastic cases also mithun, if people defaulted in actually coming and helping with the construction. So that was one of the. These pictures are actually from 1991, from the building of the Ang's house in Shangnu village of Mon district. This is Konyak tribe, belonging to the Konyak tribe. And there were over 400 people involved in this building. In the case of the Angs were the almost divine-like chiefs of the Konyaks, who were supposed to be direct descendants of the sky god Gawang. And so they had this, they had a very royal kind of status. And some of the bigger villages had satellite villages. So in the case of the Shangnu village, which is one of the very big original villages of the Konyaks, the Ang was the all-powerful, and the satellite villages also contributed labor to the building of his house. These were huge houses. They extended to over 100 meters long. They were really big. This is actually the last time, these pictures are the last time that the Ang's house was ever built in 1991. After this was never built again. For building any shelter too, there were lots of rituals. So there was a kind of sacrifice to the house spirit. So in the case of the Sema, the house spirit was called the Akirao. The Akirao was, Aki means house and Rao means spirit. So the Akirao was the house spirit, and he had to be appeased. So it was usually done with rice beer. And cock was sacrificed at the central post, and the blood was put into the post so that it would, help with keeping the house from misfortune and also give strength to the building. These kind of rituals varied between tribes. So in some cases there was a pig sacrifice. In some cases, iron was also put into the post, central post. So the main central post is where most of the rituals took place. The site before the shelter was built. So the main central post was always first put in by the eldest member of the village or the community at the time. The form and structure of the Naga dwelling was intimately connected to the natural environment in which it stood, obviously. Its materials were dictated by the forest and what it provided. So it evolved and it took birth from the forest, so to speak. And many times the villagers were, being so in such close contact with nature, were able to deal with climatic and technological issues in an amazing manner. Though the architectural forms differed widely amongst the tribes, there was a common thread visible throughout in terms of its basic responses to the climate and geography, which meant the heavy rainfall and the hilly terrain, and the very strong northwestern winds. Sorry. This house is an Angami house. You can see the house horns. These horns are actually were depicted. They depicted the status of the owner, the social status, and their position in society was clearly displayed or apparent from the house facades. So, in terms of carvings, etc., one could easily, distinguish that this was a person of status in the village. So, there were feasts of merit and genas. Genas were taboos related to feasts of merit. Feasts of merit was an animistic tradition wherein feasts were given by the owner and a mithun was sacrificed. And the mithun was sacrificed and then it was fed to the entire village. So this was actually something that showed the wealth of the owner, and the number of feasts that the house owner provided was clearly it was apparent on the facade, because you had these skulls of mithuns, then you had in the Angamis, you had these Y-shaped posts where the sacrificial mithun was tied. So the number of posts denoted how many feasts the person had given and how many genas they had followed. And symbolically, they denoted the stature of the owner of the house. Certain things like the house horns were they were only able to put up the person who had given at least four feasts of merit and done the Lesugena in the Angami tradition. So these were certain taboos where for 3 days nobody could eat a certain kind of food, or they could not hunt, or they could not eat rice. It again differed between the different tribes. The holes in the horns actually prevent them from breaking, because the wind pressure could actually break the horns, and they had these holes so that the wind could flow through and the horns wouldn't break. This Cognac house, you can see the post, the central post. The central post always extended at least about a foot above the main house. And they were always capped with palm thatch to prevent them from disintegrating with rain, etc. Now the reason for this was that as the posts in the ground kept disintegrating with time, they would just have to push the post a little down, a little further down into the ground, and this would ensure that the life of the house, remained till about 15 years. So it extended the life and durability of the house. And this was an ingenious kind of way in which to construct a dwelling and to prevent continuous reconstruction or renovation of the structure. This is another Angami house which shows another format of using the house horns. This is a Sema dwelling, so you can see the differences in construction are very apparent here. They have distinctive styles of building. Amongst the Ao, Chang and Sangtam, they had extended front gables which were decorated with various bamboo ornaments and tassels. These two signified the status of the owner, and everybody could not have them. Many of the tribes use the house as more like, I mean, it was basically a farmhouse. So, it acted like a store for implements, for grain, etc. And very few daylight hours were actually spent in the house because most people were in the fields for the day. So one has to actually look at the shelter in that form. These are some common elements that surrounded or were part of the house. One was steps that led to the house, which were of different formats. They could be made in bamboo, they were made in wood, and uh, and these again differed in the different tribes. And also, this was necessary because most of the sites were not leveled, and there was a lot of difference in level in the because it's a hilly terrain, so naturally there was a lot of level differences. Sorry. Oops, sorry. Okay. This was a pig pen, like enclosures for pigs and even sometimes for chickens. This one is for a pig and for cattle. Uh, there was a kind of like in the Konyak area, there were bamboo platforms or rear verandas called machangs, and these were sort of open areas made with purely with bamboo and stilted. So they were often like the house was built on the ground, but the back would go off into beyond the hill. So then it would be on these spidery legs. So this was a common feature in a lot of the eastern Naga houses. I've already spoken, I think, about the house horns. These were Sema and the Angami both had used to use these house horns, which denoted the stature of the owner. The elevated pig latrine sewer system. This was a very ingenious kind of a very efficient sewer system. If you could get away from the psychological disadvantage that the very pig that devoured or was the sanitation aspect was devoured later by the owner. So we had an elevated sort of platform which was covered with palm leaves, and below that were the pigs. So it was you basically did your job on top, and the pigs cleaned up after you. So this is a picture of that. Um, The interiors were usually dark, and there was no concept of windows in the earlier houses. Very common feature and standard feature of all the houses was the central fireplace. Most houses were built around the kitchen, so to speak. That was the main room and took about 80% of the area of any of the houses. So you had this drying shelf above the 3-stone hearth. There was a typical 3-stone hearth, and then you had the drying shelf above it, and this was centrally placed, and all activities of the house took place around this. The sides of the house were often used for sleeping. Either they were partitioned or they had, areas of storage. As you could see this from the sketch, there were grain baskets. Then the daws or the machete knives and various implements were placed on the walls. Seating was always low, and wooden benches and piras were usually used. The flooring was always of natural earth, except in some cases where elevated bamboo platforms with bamboo mats were used for sleeping. Roofing was always usually thatch. Across the various tribes, it was thatch. Like amongst the Konyaks, it was palm thatch, and even the thickness of the thatch, like for the Konyaks, that also designated stature and status in the village. The thicker roofs, were always those of the chief, for example, and. keep use. Sorry, I'm not. I think I've gone backwards. Sorry, yeah. The some of the houses used bamboo kind of tiling, so these were basically split bamboo that joined into each other and formed the roof. This was not a very common form of roof, but it was used a lot amongst the Western Nagas, especially the Sema and the Ao. The extended gable frontage, this was common to the Ao, Chang, and Sangtam tribes. The Rengma and the Lotha also used this form. Thatching was usually done on a bamboo framework, as you can see here, and it was layered. In case of the palm thatch, sort of panels of palm thatch were made and then layered, and they could go up to thicknesses of up to 6 to 8 inches, like in the case of the Cognac house here. The hog-backed elliptical form of the Cognac house was very distinctive, and its eaves used to be just, it used to be just above ground. So they would drain water very effectively, and they were also used for insulation. You could not hear the rain out on these roofs ever. The top of the roofs were very intricately bound with cane binding and bamboo splits. So that prevented any kind of water leakage into the interior. Stone slates were used by the Khemgan on the Burmese border, and they are the only tribe that actually used stone slate for roofing. Most of the others, as I said, were basically used thatch. The basic frame of all shelters was a timber post and beam frame, and the walls were infill. So the infill walls were usually of bamboo mat, and there were many kinds of bamboo mat kind of designs used. Either bamboo culms were woven together in a crisscross fashion, or they were in a sort of woven straight. Timber construction details, especially amongst the Angami, as you can see up here, they were done with great finesse, in fact. Sometimes rope was also used to cover the frontage of the timber to give a kind of a finish to the houses of status. This is another variation. This is slightly modernized version, which was a later probably addition in maybe the late 90s, when people started introducing windows. As I said earlier, the traditional vernacular architecture did not believe in windows at all. This is a wall made of alder. Alder is one of the trees, common trees found in the Angami area, and alder branches were used for this walling. The post and beam structure here is evident. This is the typical kind of structure with the central post. All of the traditional shelters had central posts or were built around central posts. This is the stone wall from Khonoma. The Angamis used stone masonry, and they are the only tribe in Nagaland to use stone masonry. None of the others use stone. All walls were made of bamboo mat, differing formats with different names, and also but this particular weave, for example, in the crisscross fashion, double weave, could be used only by the Ang. So even the weave distinguished whose house it was. You could figure out whose house it was. Other weaves like this, the Thoputo, were borrowed from the Kacharis by the Semas. So tribes also learned from each other at a later stage and interchanged weaves. This was the common format where bamboo mats were tied to a bamboo frame with cane or bamboo twine. Sometimes a wooden structure also was used, and the bamboo mats would be tied to those, or bamboo planks would be sort of also suspended from a timber structure. Doors and windows were also made of wood and bamboo both, sometimes elaborately carved, like in the cases of the Angami and cognacs. This is an example of a cognac door. In earlier days, they used to have very large trees. So the tree itself, the entire girth of the tree formed the door. So you had these huge trees which had a girth of sometimes 6 feet, and so the entire door was just a hewn sort of mass of wood and really heavy. This is an example of a sliding bamboo door. This is also common in some of the tribes. A later addition, I think possibly in the earlier, I would say late 90s, maybe 90s, early 90s, was this addition of bamboo grills when they started, putting at least 1 or 2 windows in the house. This is a case study of the Konyak tribe. It better illustrates the building of a shelter. The elliptical form of the Konyak house was very distinctive. It is the largest of all the tribes. The average area would be from 100 to 200 square meters. And the width of an average house would be about 10 meters or so. So they were really huge. They resisted wind pressure very effectively, these kind of roofs, by the very form and also the tapering plan, which was not accidental at all, but definitely designed to resist wind pressure. The roofs had very low overhang, sometimes right up to just about 2 feet above ground on the 2 sides. So there was no possibility of the walls getting spoiled with the heavy rainfall, and they lasted really long. So houses were on an average rebuilt, I would say, from 12 to 15 years was the average life of these houses. This is a view of the back rear veranda here. This is a typical rear veranda. Konyak houses had the central fireplace and a front where the rice was pounded and grain was stored. And then this was an area for implements. And small partitions formed, these were where people slept. This machang is this area. This was always at the rear of the house. This is a small illustration of the kind of usage of, there were some very clever usages of bamboo and how they were used for containing bottles or using, just you didn't need a shelf, but there were lots of elements like that in the house that used bamboo very effectively in its form. This is a common house of the Sema tribe. So this is just an illustration of the east and west. The Sema tribes had much smaller houses. They were on an average of 50 to 60 square meters, maximum being about 80. Rengma, Lotha, and the other western tribes also, they ranged about that. That was about the average area of a house. Framework, of course, very similar. The timber framework was the same across all the tribes, as I mentioned. But as you can see, the format was quite different. They always had this sort of, many a times below the front gable, a semicircular form again. And again, the first bit was for rice pounding or storage, and the main kitchen and another area for sleeping, partition for sleeping. The chief's house, or the Ang's house, this is of the Konyak tribe. As you can see, this was in Shangnu village. It had distinctive features of these carved pillars, which were often geometrical patterns based on tree forms. These kind of pillars only existed in the chief's house and nowhere else. they distinguished, so the chief's house was distinguished by a couple of these elements. One was this crisscross double weave pattern, the other was this kind of carved pillars, and also some front, some of the front wooden pillars would be inscribed with a lot of human and animal figures, each of which had a symbolic significance. I'll come to the significance later of each particular animal had a significance. And the next shelter type was the morung or the dormitory. This was a very multifaceted institution, and it always occupied a kind of a prime position in the colony. Each settlement was divided into colonies, and each colony had a morung. This was a so to say a dormitory of sorts, where all the unmarried boys used to sleep in this. So, from the age of 6, boys would sleep in this morung, and girls too actually slept in dormitories. But often, like in the Sema tribe, the girls used to sleep in the chief's house. A certain part of the chief's house was designated for the girls' dormitory. Morungs were specifically male, a male dominion, and the elders of this particular morung always taught them life skills. So this is a sort of a teaching establishment, literally like a school. So it worked for ceremonial reasons, it worked as a dormitory, it also taught people life skills, essential life skills like hunting and warfare. Trophies, head hunting trophies in times were all brought and displayed here as well. A very common sort of feature of a lot of the morung, especially in those of the eastern Nagas, was the log drum. The log drum was this sort of hewn long log, a special tree was used and split in the middle, and this was beaten in times of birth, at times of death. It announced all kinds of events, so to speak. So different patterns were beaten on this, and by the pattern one could figure out whether someone had been born in the village or someone had died, or they were called, in earlier times it was also used to sound an alarm, say that the village was being attacked and so everybody should gather around, etc., to defend it. Even they say that in some Sema villages, at times of the eclipse, lunar and solar eclipse, it was sounded. And for that the reason for that was also very interesting, that they felt that by sounding it in a particular way, they could bring back the light. The morungs were distinguished by the facade elements. There were all kinds of carvings of animals and figures in front, as you can see. This is a Konyak morung structure. This is an Angami one with a stone, as you can see, the stone work, and the top being wood. This is also another Konyak morung with a sculpture of a tiger. The tiger denoted strength and courage and protection, and so actually was found in almost every morung in the Konyak areas. Morungs also had, in the Angami area, had house horns. They also housed all kinds of warring implements. And the front posts had mithun heads. Mithun is the Indian bison, the Bos frontalis, and it's also the state animal of Nagaland and Arunachal. It has tremendous significance in the Naga animistic culture, and it's a symbol of wealth and prosperity. It, of course, wealth directly because, as I mentioned earlier, the feasts of merit were a sacrificial mithun, were related to sacrificing a mithun and feeding the village, so that was what gave people status in the village in earlier days. So the number of heads denoted the number of feasts and so on, and they were strung up, and the carving itself also denoted the same. The eaves boards were also carved very intricately amongst the Cognacs. These two are Cognac from the Cognac morungs, which were called pan in Cognac. They used a lot of they had a cross beam and a front post. And the cross beam, like this one you can see here, was often painted in black, white, and red motifs and had hornbill heads. Hornbill also denoted status and royalty and was a symbol of the chief. This heavy kind of carving in relief characterized the morung facade. There were very elaborate roof forms so that, within the colony they were clearly distinguished from the rest of the houses. So they had huge upturns, a sort of upward sweep, etc. in many cases, and of course, heavy embellishment. These are some forms of the morung in Cognac area. They're called pan. And as you can see there, the roofs are very distinct. This is the front beam, and this is the front central post that was always carved. So it's all like a totem. The next shelter type was the field hut. The field hut was a kind of place where, since so much time was spent in the fields, and as I mentioned, the fields were quite far away from the main body of the settlement. So since a lot of time was spent there, that's where the midday meal was cooked. That's where some of the grain was stored intermediately. And that's where people took rest during the day. So a lot of attention was paid to the field hut. In fact, while building a field hut, and especially amongst the Cognacs, there was a tradition of all the male members would first take the droppings of a cock, dried droppings of a cock, and sprinkle it all around the site to scare away the evil spirit and misfortune. The evil spirit was called the Hashi, and all the male members would carry this and sprinkle it all around. And then a tulsi plant was planted always. The tulsi was planted before actually making the hut. This was part of the ritual aspect. The tulsi also was supposed to be a way of getting rid of the evil spirit or misfortune, and to ensure that there was a good harvest. This is a Cognac. This is a case study of a Cognac a field hut. The Ang, of course, had his own distinctive field hut amongst the Cognacs. This is only amongst the Cognacs, because otherwise field huts were generally the same for all in other tribes. The Ang's field hut was shaped somewhat like that. So it was in the form of a fish, which is called the gorumas in Assamese, and the fish also donated royalty and divine status of the Ang. Even the plan itself was shaped. The plan was also in the shape of a fish. So the Ang's field hut was always built by the entire community, whereas a commoner's field hut was built by the family, relatives, and members of the colony. The last of the shelter types is the granary. This is a case study of the Cognac granary that was built on stilts to prevent mice from entering. So they had a very ingenious system, whereas this flat piece of wood, which was slightly curved, would be put just above the post. And this was based on the premise that a mouse couldn't walk upside down for too long before falling down. So it would never reach the grain. Was very effective. A lot of the granaries had carved sort of doors with mithun kind of heads again. This is a Sema picture of a Sema granary, which is again slightly lifted but did not have any rat traps. And this is a picture of the kind of grain baskets that the granaries had, which contained the rice and millets. So this is sort of a small summary of the kind of different symbols and what they denoted. What you see here is kind of this built-in stone is, in fact, carved in stone now, is Angami gate. All Angami villages settlements had these huge gates and immense fortifications to prevent them from attacks from the neighboring tribes in the early days. Now, of course, they are open gates. But these again had things like human figures. So the human and male and female figures denoted fertility. The mithun basically symbolized wealth, prosperity, and fertility again. The hornbill was a symbol of status, power, and royalty. The tiger of courage, strength, and protection. The elephant of strength. The bear of fame. The monkey donated agility and skill. The great barbet, which was used a lot by the Sema, that also was a symbol of luck and fame. Meat chunks donated basically the feast of merit given by the house owner, and also hunting prowess. Women's breasts showed success in love, or the many love affairs that the warrior had, and that gave him status, especially in the Sema and the Angami tribes. The sun, moon, and stars were symbolic of power and prowess. And the human heads, of course, of valor and courage and warrior status. So the amount of heads one took or scalps showed the courage of the warrior. Headhunting is one of the possibly most misunderstood traditions, especially amongst other Indians who have a lot of ignorance and judgment about these things. Scalp hunting was basically based on the premise that the soul matter of the person was in the head, and it was basically an end to the entire warfare. I mean, you were at war, and the number of scalps you took denoted how much of a warrior you actually were and the courage you had. So it was a kind of proof, and the bringing back of the scalps was actually bringing back strength to your village. So since the soul matter was constant, the belief was that the soul matter of the person was concentrated, you were actually correcting the strength of the people or the enemy and converting it to strength for your village. And that was the belief behind headhunting, actually. There are legends behind headhunting as well and how it started, but I won't go into that because each tribe has one and I'd have to tell you 17 different stories. Decorative elements like the carved front wall panels were basically found only in the chief's house or adorning the house facades of men of social distinction. These planks were carved in relief with mithun heads, tiger figures, meat chunks, women breasts, as I said before. This particular one I'd like to talk about. Was found in what was called the Ahuts by the Sema, and this was found in front of the chief's house. The Akakau, as in Sema is called, the chief was called the Akakau, and he had the Ahuts, which again, as you can see, has all the symbols that I earlier talked about. These carved pillars here, these are from different villages in the Mon region. The Konyaks use these kind of pillars, and they basically their origin is from trees and natural vegetation. The symbolic representations were very graphic and very much in relief, as you can see. Some of these sketches will show you the many different ways of depicting the mithun's head. This is the elephant, and these are human figures. After Christianity came to Nagaland, which was quite many years ago, the animistic traditions were discarded entirely. And in place of the chief's house, the chief's house, the position of the chief's house was kind of usurped by the church, which was always built at the highest. Then it sort of took its place and was always at the highest point of the settlement. There are many interesting examples of church architecture which you can see today, and some of them even try to copy vernacular forms. I thought I must make a small mention of the church because it is very important in Nagaland, and it deserves a mention, I think. And there's been a lot of interesting architecture now, which actually is trying to mimic the vernacular form. This is a more recent kind of thing, but I think it's worth mention, so I decided to mention it here. I'd like to end with a legend, actually, since I began with a legend. This is a very famous legend from the Cognacs in Mon district. It's called the Honu sculpture. And it's a legendary sculpture which is supposed to have magical powers. It still exists in the Ang's house in Shangnu village. And it's really huge. It's 10 feet by 20 feet and 6 feet thick. It was hewn out of a single tree. And I'm going to just relate the story a little bit. So it was the Ang of Shangnu actually took his wife from Tangnu village, which was a neighboring village of Shangnu. And as per custom, she came with her repertoire, and as part of that, one of the handmaidens called Puahoi. Puahoi was Honu's mother, actually, and she was one of the handmaidens that came with the Ang's wife, or wife-to-be. And she came to Shangnu village and kind of became a member of the village. What people started noticing about her was that she had started thieving a lot, and she would steal various people's belongings. And since thieving wasn't looked kindly upon at all in the tradition, they gave her a few warnings, but she did not listen, and she continued to steal. One day, apparently, she decided to steal something that belonged to the Young's right-hand man, and people decided that this was the last straw, and she needed to be punished severely for this. And giving up, they sort of bound her hands and feet and threw her into the river that separated the two villages, actually. Tangnu and Shangnu separated by a river. However, she emerged unscathed. And she averted death, apparently, and came out on the Tangnu side. And the two villages confirmed as to what to do with this lady. And since they had thrown her into a raging river and she had averted death, they now were a bit wary of what kind of power she had. And the Tangnu villagers said that, okay, they would decide her fate, and they decided to throw her back into the river once again. So she was thrown back into the river. But she emerged again on the opposite side, on the Shangnu side this time. And so the Shangnu people decided that this wasn't really working, and the Tangnu people gave up on her and said she was no longer a resident of Tangnu, so you decide what to do with her. And the Shangnu people decided to throw her off the steep cliff that exists in Shangnu. So they bound her hand and feet again, and they threw her off the cliff. And they thought that they were well rid of her. But a few days later, one of her friends was passing by, and she was lamenting her death and saying, "Oh, I knew," because I knew is the term used for friend, close friend, and saying, "I miss you," and stuff like that. And there was a response from below saying that, "I'm here." And she got the shock of her life and ran all the way back to the village and said that the woman was there and she's with child, and she says she needs to be rescued. So the entire village gathered, and hauled her up. By this time, they were sure that the spirits were on her side, and there was nothing they were going to be not be able to do nothing about her. So they just decided to take her back into their fold. For whatever reason, she seemed to stop thieving after the birth of this little boy. The little boy was called Honu, and he emerged as with a very sweet disposition, and endeared himself to the entire village, especially to the Ang. So one day when Honu was working in the village, he suddenly stopped, and as if in answer to a call, and said, I'm coming, and he disappeared into the forest. And after some time, people in the village, when they went to the forest to collect firewood, they heard noises of, apparently, like as if there were many people working in the village. In the forest. Sounds of a lot of people. And when they went there, they found just Honu there, carving a piece of wood, a massive tree actually, that was felled, and he was actually removing the bark and preparing it for carving. And they were completely astonished because the size and girth of the tree was such that it seemed impossible for him to have possibly cut down a tree of that size. So they they went away, and after a few days they were back again, and again they found this. It was as if a lot of people were working on something, but when they came to the clearing, they again found this boy carving this beautiful piece of sculpture, and they were really surprised to see this. And it was full of carvings of tigers and monkeys and human figures and various things. And he said he'd finished and it needed to be pulled back. But when the strong men of the village gathered and they tried to lift this, they could not even budge it, not an inch. That night, Honu had a dream in which he saw that there was some part of the sculpture had been robbed by a neighboring village. And so they went to the neighboring village and they gathered everybody and said that they found the piece of this missing piece of the sculpture, and they said as punishment that the village would have to help to pull this sculpture to Shangnu. So the villagers gathered, and all the strong men again tried to budge this, but they were unable to. Now the women had prepared a lot of feasts and refreshment for all the workers, and they were waiting at the bottom of the edge of the settlement for the men. When they found that there were no men forthcoming, they also went towards the clearing, and they saw that they could not budge this, and they offered to help, but the men scoffed at them. But the women said that, okay, go ahead, and it would not budge. So it was only when the women actually started moving the sculpture that it moved, and it was brought to the village. The Ang was thrilled with Honu for this piece of work, which was a beauty. And the magical powers of this were further. There's another story later on which says that after it was installed in the Ang's house, there was a fire, and all the people were away in the fields as usual, and there were only elderly women in the village. But with their walking sticks, they were able to move the sculpture out of the Ang's house and out of harm's way of the fire, which would not be at all possible for a sculpture of this size. So this is a small story. It still exists in Shangnu. There's now an RCC building to house it, and you can see that there. You can see this. So I'd like to end here on this note. Thank you so much. And happy to take any questions if there are any. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Nivedita, my question is about the styling of the house. Some of the granaries you said it's on stilt. Why are the houses not on stilt there? Any reason? Because it's a heavy rainfall region?
Yeah, in Arunachal, actually, the houses are stilted, but in Nagaland, they are not. It was only the Machang at the end, because even though all the houses are single storied and they're all built on ground. But I think the way the roofs were designed, because building on stilts means that you use a lot more material, and also the size of the houses is huge actually. So building on stilts would require much more structural intervention and much more material. So it was always preferred to build it. Also, since they were built on, most of the settlements, as you see, they were built on the tops. So they were along the ridge or spurs. So there was a sort of flattish land at that on top. So they didn't really need to be stilted. Just basic leveling was enough. Yes.
So you mentioned at one point that most of the buildings were environmentally and climatically quite sort of well adapted.
Yeah.
You referred to the northwesterly winds and the slopes and the heavy rainfall. So could you elaborate a little in what ways and how they were adapted to the climate and to the terrain in a way that's kind of
Yeah, sure. Should I refer to some of the photos
As you wish.
which
Up
would
to you.
help you,
Yeah,
or
sure.
should I just answer?
No, I think we would understand. But if you felt that
Okay.
it would need it
So
to be
I had actually mentioned that the eaves.
yeah, that's
there-
one. Great.
One was the way the eaves were, so that they were so low that the walls were remained untouched. That was one way, and so the thatch and also the thickness of the thatch, they were very thickly roofed. So the panels were put in layers. So as they were layered, you could get different thicknesses of roof. Right, so that was insulating, because the climate can get pretty cold as well in winter.
So, but like any orientation, direction-wise,
The east was preferred, but sometimes because of the way the ridge or spur was located, it was not possible. So east was always preferred. Also, in the colder regions, the front panels were of wood planks, so they were very good insulators, right? And also the gable, if you saw the angle, would be always above 35 degrees.
Right.
So they drained very easily. Yeah, yeah. There was also a taper towards the end. The front was upturned and there was a taper. This is also for streamlining for wind.
and where among the Angamis they use stone, did
Yes,
they use
yes.
any mortar? Did they use earth mortar, or did they just
Dry.
Dry.
Yes. Now, of course, cement was used on the outside too, but earlier it was dry stone. Yeah. Somebody. You have a question? Okay.
I was wondering, is it not possible to see these, like for your next presentation? Because they are quite tiny. Is there no way that we can have them grown up? Because there's so much detail which I feel we're missing out. Are these, is this are they only that size, you think?
Actually, one had to juxtapose them.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
there's such a lot. Actually, it's very
I know,
difficult to
but that's true, that's
put it
true.
together. And I was
Yeah.
thinking best in the kind of time that one has, how to not get people too
Yeah.
bored,
Oh.
and to be able to show the extent of things, because it's just it's just to introduce a little of this absolutely amazing variety
true,
of
yeah.
craft, architectural craft that exists in Nagaland, and it's beautifully crafted actually. Some of the, the carvings, etc. But a lot doesn't exist now, so I have to rely a lot on a couple of my drawings and things,
Yeah.
because it doesn't really exist anymore the way it was.
But thank you so much, Ritu. It was
And
absolutely.
yeah,
it
and
took us
during the
away.
British time, a lot of villages were burned down actually by the British and later by the Indian Army. So both of them contributed to us not having anything to see right now, to a large extent. So entire villages were burned down, and they lost a lot of our heritage there.
You said was throughout the there's absolutely no revival or like no intact doing things over there, things like that?
There's no real evidence of that, but what's very recently is something that I'd like to share is like, I mean, at least for me, because I felt even in 91 where things were disintegrating and you could see that it's the end of a lot of things. As a student, I was really lucky. Again, I say I was really lucky to have witnessed what I did. Over the years, what I've seen is, I mean, I'm 28 years in Nagaland, so I've seen a lot of change. There's a lot of positive. Very more recently, I would say, I saw a lot of positive change in the fact that in Tuensang, for example, which is another eastern district, the Morung institution has been revived by the church that actually destroyed it in the first place. But the interesting thing is that the church is now reviving the Morung in the changed context. So now youngsters are being, they're being taught basketry, etc., as part of their schooling, and being sort of reconnected to the Morung as a place of learning and life skills. So that's a very interesting revival. That's very recent, actually. Yeah, and it's not all over. The Angamis also. They're doing a lot of revival of the Morung also culture. At least the boys, young boys and men, they gather there regularly and every evening, and they do basketry, and they are reviving basketry. So whenever they are there, the unfortunate thing is that most of the youth has left the villages for studying outside. So they're all going to college, either in Delhi, Bombay, or other places, and Kohima, Dimapur, of course. So there are very few young people in any village anymore, which I think is a trend in a lot of places, but more so there. So you have mostly elders left in the village now.
I'm also curious as to, I mean, this is also in other parts of our country, that how come that there's this window not sort of used much in the traditional architecture? Is it because of wind or rain or?
I think, firelight, or maybe the quality of firelight, at least. See, the shelter in a different context, if you take yourself backwards, like back into the context from where it came, the shelter was not used except at night, really. Nobody spent any daylight hours in the shelter. So it was essentially a farmhouse because most people spent their time in the field. And so it didn't really need daylight. And at night, you didn't want the cold wind. And so I don't think the window played any real role at the time. I would think that would be the reason. And when I discussed it with the elders, they said that was how it was. So I guess that's it. And the other thing is that I think the quality of firelight, like the central fireplace, the quality that the firelight gave was so, it was just enough. And when you get addicted to firelight, I think you don't want anything harsher than that. Okay. But smoke works in very different ways because the walls were porous. The smoke also actually increased the life of the building because it would go up and it would smoke the rafters and they would increase their durability and life. Also, it prevented insects and various creepy crawlies of the tropics from entering the house. Also, it smoked the meat. It smoked above the shelves. It smoked the corn. It smoked the grain. So smokeless chulas never really took off in Nagaland.
Just a remark rather than a question. I enjoyed the context in which the houses were built earlier, the legends and the stories that you brought out. I would like to have a session with you where you relate stories to the structure of their, the way the society is built and the structure. The second remark again is I would also like to see the connection between the textiles and the architecture, where the wonderful Naga weaving that we all have seen, and how it is related to the architecture and the way in the context.
Textile related to architecture.
Well, related to the structure of society and therefore related to the architecture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
Textiles
these two-
are like the shawl, for example, there was a designated shawl for each tribe. You can, by looking at the shawl, know which tribe it comes from. Males had certain shawls, females had certain shawls. A man could not wear a woman's shawl and vice versa. Certain chiefs had their own shawl designs. So the design and colors and a particular weave designated status again, just like the house. So everything actually was a kind of mirror of the social structure. Everything, including like the way the house is, that way the same way the textiles were as well.
But did they use it in the house, and how did they use it in the house?
No, was not used. Textile was not used. It's basically dress. Because too much dress, for example, there was a belief that wearing too many clothes reduced your fertility. That was an ancient belief amongst the Semas. So it was not it was that, it was just to keep out the cold, really.
I have a small question. After they adopted Christianity, was there any major change in the settlement pattern or in the housing typology, or in, the relationships would have changed from the earlier structure? How did that impact the settlement?
Yeah, like I mentioned, that the church took over. And also, the church initially, in initial stages, the animistic traditions were totally denied and discarded. They were looked at as heathen and pagan, and so it was not encouraged at all. For example, in the Konyak tradition, the head hunting tattoo was a face tattoo. So it was on the face, and obviously it's a permanent thing and you can't remove it. It designated the status of the warrior, and it was something to be really proud of. It was something to be aspired to. And the women used to do the tattooing, and it was terribly painful, done with thorns. And it was called thwak or ak, depending on which village you were from, because there are many dialects. But so these kind of things, like these kind of things were the very things that brought you status were looked down upon, and everything was discarded. For example, the skulls used to be put in the morungs. This was something that people started feeling ashamed of. Once something that was to be proud of became something to be ashamed of. So naturally the whole thing changed entirely. Now the houses as such, because of the way the cluster was, or that in it the clustering did not change, but the fenestration, the morung as an institution was the most important. It was at the helm of affairs, in the animistic time. And after Christianity, the morung institution completely disappeared. So then all the old carvings, there was no one to really look after them. Nobody bothered about them because it was a matter of shame. It was sort of like that. So I think it's come a full circle now, the way church is now reviving the morung, and people are trying to get back to understanding what the animistic tradition, because Christianity doesn't mean that you discard your art and culture as well. So, maybe bring it to a different context. The church definitely took over.
What is with the neat chunks that you said that also were used for decoration?
It denoted,
Neat chunks.
in the ahats, the totem pole of the chief. I told you Sema chief that it has parts of these carvings of these meat chunks. So they denoted, hunting prowess as well as. No. I don't know. I could take you back there, but yeah, it should point. Do you want me to point it out to you? That's okay. Yeah. Thank you.
No, you just wait. It's just to take this chance. One idea of the project that we are talking about is to, like this, as much as possible, extend this kind of discussion. And often what happens is the lecture is very tight and things are left out. That always happens. And if there's a time for the speaker and the listeners, it goes on. Also, on the other hand, there are discussion meeting kind of things. There are different things. So what we have been discussing is that if we set up a situation, platform, where there are more details available, like somebody is asking for, it's not possible to show every detail. So if this thing is there, then one can hook onto it and ask questions, and the interactions can happen. And some third person or fourth person may listen to that, get other ideas also, which generally happens. So if that kind of networking is possible, that was the objective of this, the larger project, of which these are immensely valuable sort of inputs. And there are various kinds of lectures. So thank you very much. And quite often it happens that time nahi hai, abhi chale jate hain, ghar jate hain. So you might have to go, but then later on come back to it. Adi Adis, of course, is publishing. I think you are. So book is on the way. So books come, but this is something different. Thanks.
That's on the Gonyak and Sema.
That's on the Gonyak and Sema only.
Yeah.
Then I remember guiding a dissertation of Sandhya Narayan, if you know her. She was comparing Apatani and Nishi settlements. One sedentary and one nomadic. I forgot to tell her, she's in Delhi, she could have come also. So that, and kind of connections like that one can establish. It happens accidentally but more formally. Right? So I think we can do the honors.
Thank you, Ms. Ritu Varuni, for sharing your wide experience generously. Architectural Heritage Division would like to thank Chairman and Member Secretary INTAC for the support that such seminal research project gets from them. We are thankful to members of Advisory Committee of AH for encouraging AH in this research on architectural styles. We request Chairperson AH Advisory Committee, Professor K.T. Ravindran, to kindly give a token of our appreciation to Ms. Ritu Varuni.
We worked together many years ago. That's why the color code.
We are very thankful to admin and maintenance staff of INTAC for their unrelenting support towards each event. Thank you to the team at AH for working consistently on the project and humbly incorporating reviews. We highly appreciate the vision of our Principal Director, Mr. Divya Gupta, for conceptualizing this pioneering study, and Professor Rajat Ray for his intellectual guidance and being a very interactive advisor and critic. Last but not the least, the interest shown by audience like you encourages us to organize such activities. Requesting you all to write your email and phone numbers in our list at the reception for us to keep you informed about the lecture series and events organized by us. Thank you.